I'm just going to talk very briefly today about primary sources and their ability to help in the classroom, particularly with subjects that might be perhaps dry or otherwise difficult for students to approach. And the particular case study will deal with Indian boarding schools today. So, in a traditional setting, the sage on the stage, the teacher or the professor, right, would go through a long lecture about boarding schools, the historical context in which they emerged, and perhaps talk about the effect on students, the effect on parents. And that's all well and good, and I think it's important, and I still believe we need to do that in history classrooms. But there's a way, I think, that we can bring it to life for students beyond just the material we present in the classroom. So very quickly, just remind you or let you know if you weren't already aware of the context of the late 1800s, the quote-unquote Indian problem from the federal government's perspective had reached a point where military confrontation was no longer a real necessary option. After the Battle of Little Bighorn in the summer of 1876, there was a lot of talk among administrators, federal policymakers, that there was a better way to do this. And one man who genuinely believed he had a better way to do this was Captain Richard Henry Pratt. He said, "Please let me have some Indian people, give me a month with them, I will kill the Indian but save the man. Strip the culture away from them, and in the wake of that process there will be a new person, a new American person." Finally, by 1879, the federal government was convinced this is a good idea, it's going to work. They gave Pratt his school, Carlisle Indian Boarding School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And this is a class picture of the first class in 1879. Pratt himself was very fond of pictures like these, the before and after. So here you have a group of Indian children as they arrived to the boarding school, and here you have the same three children a month after their tenure at the boarding school. And you can see the boys' hair would be shorn, their clothes obviously changed from traditional clothing to the military uniforms. And this is a system that goes back really in time, possibly beyond the Spanish missions, but certainly the Spanish missions were a model for American administrators to use by the 1870s, to basically take a native person as they are and try to turn them into something that you want. This is going to be, from the federal government's perspective, more cost-effective. It will cost less people in terms of lives lost during military engagements, and therefore it's seen as a policy the government wants to go forward with. So in the next 20 years, we see the emergence of boarding schools across the western United States. Notice the dense concentration on the plains, the northern plains. This is, of course, because that's where a lot of the problems were from the government's perspective. This is the home of Lakota people, Cheyenne, and obviously very close to the site of the Little Bighorn battle. A couple schools in Colorado here, Fort Lewis, and there was a school in Grand Junction. Of course, Fort Lewis today is a college. The school that I have studied the most and the files that I've gotten into were here in Nevada, in northern Nevada, at a school known as Stewart Indian School, also called Carson Indian School. And I was working in San Francisco, going through the archives in South San Francisco, because there's a national branch of the regional archives there, or a regional branch of the National Archives there, rather. And I know a lot of you have worked through archives. It can be quite boring. You get into it for about 2 hours, you take a break, you come back, you go another 2 hours, and you're going through any number of documents that perhaps are interesting or not. But then there are these moments when you come across these hand-scrawled letters, these handwritten letters. And here's one that I want to read to you because it's hard to read in the cursive here. This is from a mother writing to the superintendent of the Carson Indian School. "Some time ago, I sent a letter to my son, named Pedro Cordova, an inmate of your institution. The letter was returned to me through the dead letter office marked deceased. Does this mean that my son is dead? I'm greatly shocked and grieved about this solemn matter, and I would greatly appreciate an answer from you as to the cause and particulars. If my fears are true, I am anxiously waiting your reply." So, when I read this for the first time, we were celebrating, it was close to the birthday of my second son, and this gave me a real moment of pause. I thought about what it would be like for me to receive information about my child's death in this manner, or if this mother received information about her child's death. And the wonderful thing about the federal government, they keep fantastic records. So a little bit later into this file, I found the reply. Dear Ms. Cordova, in reply to your letter of December 16, 1919, I regret to state that Pedro Cordova died at this school on October 3, 1919. Some time before his death, I asked his brother Manuel if there was anyone whom we should inform concerning his condition. And when he died, I again asked Manuel if there was anyone whom we should write to. Manuel told me at the time that he would be the only one who needed to be informed. Manuel was stationed in Reno at the time. He came down for the funeral, and I suppose, of course, he would let you know all about the circumstances. Pedro had been in the sanatorium at the school for a long time, and it was clear for months before he died that he could not live long. As Manuel was in the habit of coming over quite frequently, I, of course, assumed, or supposed rather, that he kept you informed concerning the condition of Pedro, or concerning his condition. Pedro was buried in the school cemetery on October 9th, 1919. Very truly yours, and there's a signature there from the superintendent, Frederick Snyder. This file is obviously one of many files that exist in the National Archive. These primary sources exist in the Library of Congress, and they tell a story that we as professors and teachers cannot tell on our own. Without these sources, the lecture on Indian boarding schools becomes rather pedantic. I mean, depending on who's doing it, depending on the timing and the audience. With these sources, you can hand this to a student, both of them, and ask some of the same questions Kelly was asking of her students. And I love Kelly's idea about using various technologies to engage our students. Another letter that I'll just share with you very quickly comes from a student this time, a student named Susie Corbett. Dear Sir, and she's writing to the superintendent of the Carson Indian School, I'm going to ask you if I could go home this summer and see my mother and sisters. I haven't seen them for 2 years already, and this is going to be my 3rd year this coming year. If I don't go home this summer, I'm going home next summer, if you promise me to. My mother's been begging me to go home this summer and last summer too. It seems to me that I don't care for them when I don't pay attention to them. Mr. Snyder, that's the superintendent, I am going home next summer. If anything should happen to my mother, if anything should not happen to my mother, rather. She's got 2 little girls to take care of. I used to work for them at home, and she has a place for me already. And now some other people are working in my place. So I am going home next summer. We're having a nice time here, but Mother wants me to come home and see her this summer or next summer, so please let me go home. Well, that's all I'm going to say. Goodbye from yours truly, Susie Jr. Corbett. Answer soon. P.S. Send me some pills for my headache, please. And again, because of the fastidious nature of record keeping in the federal government, we have the response, a brief one this time, from the superintendent. Dear Susie, I have your letter of recent date asking permission for you to go home for this summer or next summer. I think it would be best for you to remain here this summer when you return, as you would have so little time to visit your people before school opened on September 5th. If the superintendent at home will recommend it, we may allow you to go home next summer. I hope you're enjoying the summer in Oakland this year. We will be glad to see you. I can't make out the bottom line here. Kind regards, I am very truly yours, the superintendent. So again, here we have this letter that demonstrates the total and thorough control of the pupils at the Indian schools. And something I should have mentioned at the beginning here, the schools were mandatory. The federal government demanded that Indian children be taken to the schools. They tried with parents. Originally, Pratt had used adults, and he found that adults were very hard, very difficult, because once you had pulled them out of their traditional ways, once you had stripped them of their language, their culture, their hair, if they're men, their long hair would be shorn, they'd often go back and revert to their traditional culture. But kids, if you can get them before their culture is intact, you can shape them. You can turn them into Americans, and this is mandatory. How many files exist? How many letters are out there from grieving parents, from parents who had no idea that their child had passed away? I have a colleague and friend at Notre Dame, a guy named Brian Collier, and he was doing research on the Carlisle School, and he said there's a little fence around the school grounds today, and he kind of kicked some overgrowth around the fence and looked behind it, and there's a huge cemetery, a lot of headstones that were not open to the public necessarily, and it raised all kinds of questions for Brian about why that's not part of the public tour for Carlisle, and how many children were buried on those school grounds, and how often were parents informed in a way similar to the way Mrs. Cordova was informed. So I think the challenge for us as educators is to get these documents, particularly these handwritten documents, which really invite you into the world of this parent, into the hands of our students. And from there, it's up to the students to apply themselves, to apply critical thinking and analysis, and we can direct them. We can give them questions. We can give them the toolbox that will allow them to ask the questions that a historian might ask. But ultimately, the job becomes the students to interpret these documents. Almost done. Just two things, very, very quickly. I just was thinking of this, so I have to share it. There's a great story of one of the boarding schools in the Plains area in South Dakota. There was a man who was incredibly eager to get to the boarding schools, an American man. He wanted to teach Indian people. He wanted to help Americanize. This was something that he saw as his Christian duty. So he set up his classroom very carefully, and he lined the walls with portraits of the presidents, and then in the middle of the classroom he put a portrait of Jesus, and from the first day he said, this is the man. This is the person you want to emulate. This is the person you want to model your life after. And one evening an elder came to visit him, and he asked questions about what's happening at the school through an interpreter. And he kept coming back to this one question that apparently his grandkids had given him, and he said to the teacher, so let me get this straight. You say that this man on the wall, this picture, this is the best man. This is who we're supposed to live just like. And the teacher said, yes, that's right. I'm glad you're getting that. He said, well, how come he has long hair? And the teacher, of course, had no answer to that. And he had to answer honestly, I don't know. I don't know why we want to cut your hair, and Jesus has long hair. The last thing I'm going to say, in history there is this idea that we have 5 C's, the 5 critical C's for historical thinking. There is change over time, causality, context, complexity, contingency, and I would suggest we add one more C to our list, and that's compassion, historical compassion. And a document or documents like these allow us that window to get into that world and ask ourselves, what would we feel as that parent? What would we feel as Susie Corbett if we couldn't go home that summer and see our mother who we hadn't seen for 2 years? And that might lead us to new questions, new modes of inquiry, new understandings, and ultimately bring life to history for our students. So I thank you for your time today, and I'm welcome to any questions you might have, comments, and I hope this dialogue continues to grow among educators as we think about getting primary sources into the hands of our students. Thank you.